Broadhaven is a quaint little village in Pembrokeshire, West Wales, with a population of about 850. Its principal claim to fame is as a seaside resort, just 6 miles from the county town of Haverfordwest West. Broadhaven has been catering to holidaymakers since at least the Victorian era. For those who resided there year-round in 1977, employment centered around the tourist trade, farming, and the nearby oil refineries. There were also close links with the RAF Broughty, now Cawdor Barracks, which in 1977 was home to a tactical weapons unit that neighbored an American oceanographic research center, employing some 300 U.S. Navy personnel. Although top secret at the time, it is now well known that USNF Broughty was one of a number of stations monitoring hydrophones, undersea microphones to track Soviet submarines. The site was deactivated in 1995, and the Americans relocated the Joint Maritime Facility at St. Mawgan in Cornwall. What this meant was that while Broadhaven was deemed to be firmly in the firing line of potential Soviet attacks, it was all but unknown to the British public at large. That was about to change. On Friday, February 4, 1977, during lunchtime at Broadhaven Community Primary School, a group of boys, Michael Webb 10, David George 9, and Sean Garrison, playing football saw a strange cigar-shaped object land in a field beyond the school grounds. Sean remembered, quote, "It was flattish and had 10 or 11 windows and a door with a runway leading from the door, and it was silver." End quote. David added, quote, "He wasn't a very tall person, and he didn't look very nice either." End quote. Michael Matheson Webb said, quote, "It was silver and cigar-shaped, with a big dome and a red light flashing on top. We couldn't believe it at first. One of the boys ran down the hill to tell Sir, but he didn't believe it. I watched it for between 3 or 5 minutes. It had a flashing red light, and I'm sure it was a spaceship. It definitely wasn't a helicopter. Everyone is sure that they saw something. It seemed cigar-shaped with a large dome on top. I was frightened when I saw it." End quote. Philip James Reese, 10, remembered, quote, "Sean and David, George, came running in and said that there was something there. So me and some other boys went up to the top of the playing field. We saw something silver and dish-shaped. There seemed to be a door opening from the object. David Davies, presumably meaning George and Tudor Jones, saw a figure. They said it was silver. The object had a dome on the top of it with a light. It was very dull day, but I did see something." End quote. Philip's first sighting was about 1:30 p.m., and he claimed the UFO was still there when he went back into the school at 2 p.m. Quote, "My friends and I asked the headmaster to have a look at the object, but he refused. A couple of my friends saw the movement of a figure, but I did not. I was frightened. My two friends, Tudor and David, were very frightened." End quote. Jeremy Passmore, 9, also saw the UFO during lunch break. Quote, "I saw the UFO when it was dinner time. It was a silvery green and it had a yellowy orange to red color light to it. It was a disc at the bottom and a sort of dome on the top with the light on top. It was about 300 yards away. It moved a minute and then disappeared. It did have a noise, but I didn't hear it. We felt very scared. David George wanted someone to go to the toilet with him. Tudor Jones was nearly crying because he was scared he was going to be disintegrated or something. So we all rushed in. Some of our school did not believe us. We tried to make them believe us, but they would not." End quote. In answer to the specific question from Peter Paget, Jeremy stated that the sighting lasted not less than 5 minutes. The object was on the ground, and he saw a person in a silverish suit about 350 yards away. David R. George, 9, saw both the object and the humanoid, initially after 1 p.m. and then again at 3:35 p.m. He stated that the object was huge and silver-colored. It was shining and humming and looked like a saucer with a point. He saw the occupant, who was silver-suited and whose features were not seen apart from, quote, "odd long ears." He also said the one boy was so frightened that he cried. Tudor Owen Lloyd Jones, 10, didn't deny his terror. He reported seeing an object at ground level, behind a bush, and stated that he saw, quote, "a man," which led to him becoming very scared. Paul Williams was seemingly also with the group, and recalled, quote, "We saw something come out of it. It had a helmet. We ran and told Sir, and when we went back, it wasn't there." End quote. Other children known to have seen the craft were Martin Evans, Michael George, Andrew Lewis, Andrew Evans, and Leslie Neilhorn. As the day progressed, the craft moved along the perimeter of the field, witnessed by the children, and members of staff. Today, the figure most associated with the school sightings is David Davies, as the only one of the children still willing to talk openly to the media. Then, age 10, Davies wasn't part of the other boys' friendship group and recounts that as the weather was bad that day, he stayed indoors during break, only hearing about the UFO when classes resumed after lunch. Deciding he would debunk these rumors when the school let out at 3:30 p.m., Davies walked to the top of the playing field and saw nothing but Philip Reese and the others trying to get closer to take a look. As the other boys trailed off and determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, he figured he'd climb over the fence and go through the small stream to see the spot. He was only halfway over the fence when he saw it, hovering above the ground, about 45 feet long, iridescent silver finish. A central dome covered the middle third with a slowly pulsating red light. The sliding lasted about 10 seconds with the craft hovering, perhaps trying to take off, before disappearing back below the tree line. Davies says he felt no fear, only amazement. His instinct was to stay and look, yet he couldn't overcome a strong urge to run away, like his life depended on it. It was as though the suggestion had been placed in his head, and there was nothing he could do but obey. When he reached the front of the school, he got into his taxi and went home, where his mother could see was agitated. Class teacher Mrs. Morgan later said, quote, "I saw it too, you know. It was real. When they went, a little whirlwind of dust came across the playground. It was almost as if they were saying goodbye." End quote. At 4:50 p.m., David Davies' mother rang Randall Jones Pugh, a local Bufora British UFO Research Association coordinator, who she knew well as he had only recently retired as a local vet and was also the brother-in-law of the owner of the farm they were living on. Pugh drove straight over to their home in the Tiers Cross to interview David, and they then went back to the school to see the field, but by now it was 6 p.m., dark, and raining heavily. They tried again the following day, this time with Andrew Lewis and Western Telegraph, the local newspaper. Although they searched the area thoroughly, they could find no physical evidence on the ground, possibly as a result of rain the previous night. A nearby telegraph pole, however, was found to be damaged, with the crossbeam hanging at an angle. When Peter Paget began his investigation in July, he interviewed the boys and their parents and was taken to see the landing site, which she described in some detail. Guided by two of the boys, I visited the exact spot over which the craft had been seen. The hillside behind us was quite steep, very uneven and muddy, and, I thought, inaccessible to anything but a tractor. We were in a smallish field, hemmed in by high trees and traversed by 450-volt substation power lines supported on wooden poles. No helicopter pilot in his right mind would come down here, and access by a light aircraft could not possibly have avoided a complete disaster. One of the boys pointed out a particular power line pole, which he stated the UFO had at one point touched. He indicated where the cross T-piece metal was bent, and indeed it was out of true on this side by about 30 degrees. A little to the left, a substantial branch on one of the trees was strangely discolored, the leaves being more yellow than on the rest of the trees. Quote, "Most of the other children won't come here anymore," end quote, stated my guide. Quote, "As they say, it's haunted now." End quote. I noted that this implied that he was braver than the rest. A short distance away, the headmaster had interviewed all the children separately and also collectively afterwards, and then asked them to go away into different rooms and independently draw what they had seen. By Monday morning, word of the sighting had spread, and the boys' head teacher decided to do some investigating of his own. He interviewed each of the children, then had them go into different rooms and independently draw what they had seen. He said, quote, "Their stories were the same and have remained the same. At my age, I'm naturally skeptical, but I'm convinced that they saw something. I do not believe primary school children are capable of a sustained, sophisticated hoax. The thread which appears to run through their stories is that the object was a silvery yellow cigar shape with a dome and possibly a light on top," end quote. Hugh Turnbull decided to run with the story in the Western Telegraph that Monday, February 7th. Quote, "The flying saucer was first seen at lunchtime on Friday, February 4th, 1977, behind a bush about 300 yards from the school. Most of the children give the object a classical saucer shape, though others have drawn it looking more like a pudding or even a cigar. Some accounts give it a dome and windows. Others say it had a flashing light. The children say it disappeared and reappeared from time to time. It was seen by other pupils during the afternoon break and immediately after school. 6 of the youngsters say they saw a spaceman with the saucer. He was dressed in the same silvery gray color as his saucer and, according to some witnesses, had pointed ears like Mr. Spock." End quote. BBC News Round featured the story that afternoon, including a short telephone interview with the headmaster. Media interest quickly intensified, with articles appearing in newspapers around the country and further afield, until the absence of the secretary to help deal with the inquiries of the headmaster had to leave the school telephone off the hook. Some administrator, Liz Philpott, was sure the boys must have seen a sewage vehicle from the works located just behind the field where the craft had been sighted. She went to ask the manager, but he told her it couldn't have been. They had no vehicles in the area that day, and it was so boggy anyway that it would have been pretty much impossible for one to get down onto that field, let alone back off again. It has often been suggested over the years that the craft must have been a slurry tanker or a drowned aircraft from RAF Browdy, but this ignores the fact that given the locale, the boys were all very familiar with the agricultural equipment and RAF aircraft. Although Broadhaven received the most media attention, other schools in the vicinity also had their own close encounters of the third kind. The day before, on Thursday the 3rd, around 20 children at Hubbardston Primary School, about 7 miles away in Milford Haven, saw a, quote, cigar-shaped object hovering over the playground. On February 9th, a pupil at Pembroke Comprehensive School was early for school at 8:45 a.m., meaning there were few people about. The Bufora Journal reported that, quote, after walking around for a while, he heard a buzzing noise and looked round to see a plate or saucer-shaped UFO, mostly silver. It had yellow-green lights on the side and a kind of retro rockets. On the top of the craft was a round thing like an egg yolk. This was mostly gray, but flashed to white. The witness tried to find someone else to confirm the report, but by the time he had done so, the object had disappeared. The whole incident lasted about 45 seconds. The object was sharply defined and stayed completely still, but revolved. Witness noticed that the birds nearby were disturbed, end quote. The next day on the 10th, Mark Jones and Llewell Edwards, 12, saw a blue flashing light about 40 yards away while they were playing in a field near Havensford Grammar School, which is about 6 miles away from Broadhaven. The boys threw a stone at it, which sent it rushing off at high speed. As it did so, an orange cigar-shaped object about 15 feet long materialized beneath it. The UFO then hovered for a while before vanishing. The boys were so shook up by the sighting they ran to report the incident at the police station. Police drove them back to the field but could find no sign of it. Further afield, children at a local school about 170 miles away spotted a UFO on the afternoon of Wednesday, February 16th. 9 girls and their teacher, Mrs. Williams, were outside playing netball when a strange object appeared in the sky. Williams had the girls all draw a picture of what they had seen, and each of them drew a cigar-shaped object with a black dome. In 2009, one of the girls was the subject of the S4C documentary on the sighting. She said, quote, I remember that it was a cold winter's day and that the sky was clear. We all saw it. We went back into the school and we all made a picture of what we had seen. We did them individually, and when we studied them, we realized that they were all remarkably similar. The object traveling across the sky had a shiny base with a dark dome top. Later, we also made a model of what we saw. Our headmaster contacted RAF Valley to check if there had been low-flying aircraft in the area, but there hadn't been. There was no explanation for what we saw, end quote. On February 17th, a teacher at Broadhaven Primary saw the craft return. She wanted to stay anonymous, but told Randall Jones Pugh, quote, on leaving school, something caught my eye. I stopped and could see a large object, oval-shaped with a slight dome. The color was shiny and metallic. I also noted ridges and stepped back intending to call someone, and then heard a humming noise and watched the object slide away to the left in a field among some trees. I know the area very well, as I have frequently walked there. The time was approximately 10:30 a.m. and it was pouring with rain. The distance was about 200 yards. End quote. Later that same day, 2 dinner ladies saw it. with one claiming a figure climbed into the craft before it moved off up a slope and disappeared behind some trees. They decided that it must have been a council sewage truck and went to tell the headmaster that they had solved the UFO mystery. The headmaster told them it was too boggy. The following morning, the women visited the spot with their husbands, determined to prove the headmaster wrong. They quickly found themselves in a foot-deep bog. As the days passed, those close to the boys only became more convinced of their story. Michael Webb's father, Tim Webb, was a squadron leader overseeing the advanced instruction of fighter pilots at RAF Browdy's Tactical Weapons Unit. He told Peter Paget, quote, "I believe him implicitly. I've yet to see a UFO, but I think there has to be something supernatural or paranormal," end quote. He went on to opine that it was logical any extraterrestrial visitor would use a matte silver finish because it was better for heat absorption and camouflage. Even when press coverage turned from incredulous to ridicule, the boys stood by their story. In 1995, the headmaster told the Western Telegraph that he was still unsure of what the thing was, but didn't doubt the children were being honest. In the late 1990s, journalist Ray Gosling tracked down some of the kids and interviewed them, finding that they all stuck by their version of the events. Although the children were the face of the Welsh flap, they were not the only ones seeing strange things in the area. Reports of strange lights in the sky were commonplace at Abbotsford West Police Station, and the archives show that there were plenty of reports in Bufora and other agencies during the late 1976 and early 1977 era. Some people had more intense experiences. On Sunday, March 13th, Stephen Taylor, 17, saw lights in the sky at about 9 p.m. after walking his girlfriend home. There was a glowing pear-shaped object surrounded by an orange light. He called on some friends who thought he was joking when he mentioned the strange object, then continued on home alongside the perimeter fence of the American installation at RAF Browdy. He noted a black shape obscuring the lights from the nearby farmhouse at about 9:30 p.m. Quote, "It looked about 40 to 50 feet across. I noticed a dim glow around what seemed to be the underside," end quote. He leaned against a gate to observe it, thinking perhaps it was a new silo, and then lit a cigarette. Suddenly he heard a noise like someone stepping on dry leaves and looked on his right to see a terrifying figure dressed in a silver spacesuit with its face visible. It had a kind of box over its mouth with a long dark tube going over its shoulder. Quote, "He was like a skinny human and about 6 feet tall. I noticed high cheekbones, like an old man, and a large eye like a fish's, round and sort of glazed. I took a swing at it and fled. I don't know whether I hit it. I never looked back, but kept on running till I got home," end quote. When he got in, Stephen recalled that his pet dog, a normally affectionate Pomeranian, was very upset, and, quote, "its hair was standing on end." Randall Jones Pugh investigated the sighting on behalf of Bufora. He visited the site on Monday evening, but it was too dark to make much out. He went to look again on Tuesday morning, but by that point, the field had been trampled down by cattle. Pugh told the Western Telegraph, quote, "This is certainly no hoax. When the boy is as frightened as Stephen was, and especially when his mother confirms that there must have been something there, there is a lack of normality about the whole thing," end quote. This sighting has the highest potential to be part of a purported pranking done by members of the fire team stationed at the U.S. Naval facility in Browdy. In 2007, James Carlson from Albuquerque, New Mexico, wrote into the Fortean Times. He was stationed at the U.S. Naval facility in Browdy in the 1980s, and in his letter, he described how a colleague named Steve saw him reading a book about paranormal incidents. The book quoted an RAF officer, maybe investigating officer FLT Lieutenant Cohen, who stated that descriptions of the alien suits were in no way similar to contemporary military uniforms or protective clothing used at the local oil refineries. Steve, however, told Carlson that the firefighting gear used by American military personnel on the base was very similar. Quote, "Steve told me that while serving on the fire team of his division, he would often don the asbestos suit and oxygen-breathing apparatus provided. Fire preparation drills, even those conducted at night, would require members of the fire team to search the areas around the base. And Steve claimed that during these drills, he became responsible for 2 of the alien sightings," end quote. On Saturday, March 26, 7:50 a.m., Mrs. Josephine Hewinson saw a flying saucer resting on the grass in their front garden from an upstairs window at Lower Broadmoor Farm. She told Peter Paget in the summer of 1977, quote, "It was silver-colored, about 50 foot across the base and shaped like a jelly mold. It was as high as a double-decker bus. The greenhouse it was parked alongside is 13 feet to the eaves, but this towered above it. There was no movement. It had no visible windows or openings. I waited for something to emerge. It didn't. It went after 10 minutes. It left no mark, not even a broken twig." End quote. In a more detailed account to Randall Pugh Jones, she said, quote, "It was in 3 tiers. It seemed to be round, but when you see a thing in cross-section, I suppose you can never be sure. There was a definite dome to the start with a central portion, but there seemed to be a rounded ridge, if you know what I mean, between the layers, like the Rowntree's jelly. Yes, rather like jelly. When I described it to the children I saw, it looked rather like a squash jelly mold, which really it did. It was a smooth aluminum-colored bulbous shape. It was pretty well as high as the greenhouse, 15 feet maybe, and about double in the greenhouse in width, which would have made it about 35 to 40 feet wide. It was obscuring the whole of the greenhouse door. The greenhouse door is about 18 feet wide, and it was probably twice the width. There was no sound, but we had the milking machine on at the time, and that can be quite noisy." End quote. Mrs. Hewison watched it for about 2 minutes, then went to wake up the kids to see it. By the time she got back, within the minute, it was gone. They looked for marks, but there was nothing to see. Quote, "It was impossible to see anything. The tractors had been back and forth because they'd been planting potatoes." End quote. Having already seen strange lights in the sky a few nights previously, on April 19th, Mrs. Rosa Glanville, proprietress of the Havenford Hotel, Little Haven, was awoken at about 2:30 a.m. by strange noise and lights. Rosa was awake at about to go to bed and stressed that there was absolutely no sound. In fact, an uncanny silence prevailed over the area. Her daughter Francine, who was in Spain at the time of the sighting, recalled in 2016 that, quote, "It was early morning and Mum was awoken by a buzzing noise. She thought she'd left the gas boiler on. Once downstairs, she realized the noise was from outside. She looked out and saw about 100 feet away an oval object she could only describe as a spacecraft with lights slowly land and 2 figures emerge in silver suits. She was terrified because the figures, although reminiscent of men, had exceptionally long arms and legs. Their heads were covered by helmets. She called them, quote, creatures." Speaking to BBC in 2007, Rosa said, quote, "It was a bit like an upside-down saucer. It looked like a jelly to start with. There was so much heat. I was by the window. My face felt burned. There was light coming from it and flames of all colors. Then the creatures came out of these flames. That's what I don't understand. I shouted, 'Hello, what are you doing there?' They looked faceless. I couldn't see their features." End quote. To Paget in 1977, she said, quote, "They looked like human beings, and yet they didn't. They seemed to be trying to measure something." End quote. In this account, one of the figures stood and looked up at her, and realizing she had been seen, Rosa ran to wake her husband, Hayden. By the time he was out of bed and at the right window, the figures and their craft had disappeared. On Friday, April 15th, Pauline's nephew, 11-year-old Mark Marston, was out looking for birds' nests in hedges in his home village of Herd Branston, some 5 miles away from Ripperston Farm, when a red glow appeared in the sky, about 50 yards away. A few seconds later, a strange figure appeared, quote, "dressed in a silver suit like a diver, with a large helmet and a square, featureless face." End quote. Mark ran home crying and screaming, which according to his father was the only reason they believed him. Terry Marston said, quote, "He was very frightened. His story was the same every time, and we couldn't catch him out." End quote. The day before, on Thursday, April 14th, 5 children, including 13-year-old Deborah Swan and her brother, saw a football-sized UFO hovering near Herd Branston, Headguro. It was about 6:30 p.m., and the following a visit to the park, the kids decided they would go looking for this outer space thing. They found it, Deborah said. Quote, "There was something in the field opposite out of the ordinary. I have never seen anything like it before in my life. I thought it was my eyes playing a trick, but it wasn't. The most astonishing thing about it was the color, which was a brilliant gleaming silver. The shape was like a round football. Also the movements. It moved at all angles, backwards, frontwards, left to right. As we moved, it moved as well. For example, if we moved to the left, so did this thing. If we moved to the right, it did the same thing. We then ran back as fast as we could. We didn't hesitate to look back, but just kept running with fright." End quote. On Saturday, April 23rd, Pauline and Billy were sat up late watching the midnight film, a Western, when they had the fright of their lives. Looking through their living room window was a figure standing over 7 feet tall with exceptionally long arms, wearing a silver spacesuit and helmet with an opaque black visor and breathing tube. As the figure stepped closer to the window, the glass rattled and the TV picture, which had been growing steadily worse, was lost to white noise. Frightened, Pauline raced upstairs and got the children out of bed. Billy went to find their Labrador, Blackie. He was out in the hall cowering, so Billy opened the front door and dragged him out to go and chase away the intruder. Blackie just howled and ran off, frightened. By mid-June, Blackie had to be put down because the family said he seemed to have been driven mad. Billy went back into the living room to find the figure still at the window. Paget says that the whole family huddled together in the living room watching the figure stand silent and inscrutable, while Harold says Pauline stayed upstairs with the children until the police arrived. Eventually the figure shifted back a little, causing the TV signal to improve, and it was enough to jolt the family into action. They went into the rear kitchen and rang the police, and Richard Hewitson, their farm manager, who lived at the Lower Broadmoor farm. Two police constables attended. In 1996, one of them said that he had never seen a family more terrified. In 2015, PC Ernest Jones spoke to Channel 5 and said that both Pauline and Billy were very frightened. Quote, "And we're not talking of a soft man working 9 to 5 in an office. We're talking of a man well used to going out of the house all times of the day and night, checking the cattle. No way would he come out of the house with us. No way." End quote. Although police found nothing, they were convinced the family had seen something that night. Whatever the truth of the matter, the next day the family found that the leaves of a rose bush under the window seemed burned to a light brown crisp. The paintwork, too, was said to have been damaged, and this was far from the last of the Coombs sightings. In May, Pauline saw a landed UFO from her kitchen window, and when she and Billy inspected the field, later they found a circular burn mark in the grass. Joanne and Leanne, playing in the field closer to the coastline, crouched in the long grass as a silver-suited figure, like the one they had seen in April, walked up from the nearby beach, passing within about 12 feet of them. Later that same month, the twins were playing in the field again with brother Kieran when they saw 3 UFOs in the sky. The lowest of them, at an elevation of perhaps less than 50 feet, dropped a kind of metal ladder from which a silver-suited figure descended. The UFO also dropped a fluorescent red box, which, after the figure had returned to the craft and the UFO had flown off, the children spent around an hour searching for, to no avail. On June 7, 1977, Pauline took the younger children to a Jubilee party, leaving Clinton at home. A strange silver car turned up with 2 exceptionally tall men in gray-blue suits with waxy skin, high foreheads, and cold, unblinking eyes. Clinton, uneasy about their intentions, refused to answer the door. Meanwhile, Caroline Kloss was putting out some rubbish. The men approached her and asked for Pauline, who had yet to feature substantially in the press with a foreign accent. After she told them she wasn't home, they went to Havenfort Hotel, where they spoke to Francine Glanville, who told them her mother was out, something Rosa later let Pauline know by telephone. However, when skeptic Hilary Evans visited Kloss, she tore holes in the story. She told Evans that the men were completely normal looking, and first came to her door to ask if she was Mrs. Coombs. Had she been warned off? Or was this simply another example of the Coombs, quote, jazzed up media account? In July, Pauline began her annual 6-month job at Turkey Packing Factory, and things began to settle down to a large degree. This has led skeptics to suggest that Pauline invented much of the story to add some drama and excitement to her life. They point out that this was not Pauline's first experience with the strange happenings while living in a caravan. Pauline saw an image of the Virgin Mary in the window. It appeared at 10:30 p.m. and remained for half an hour each night. Sometimes it took on the appearance of Jesus with outstretched arms. The local Roman Catholic priest brought his Sunday school class to see it. When Pauline was in hospital having a baby, Billy burned the caravan and moved his family to another one. Others see this as evidence that the events at Ripperston Farm were less paranormal and more supernatural. Many of the strange happenings around the farm have parallels with recorded poltergeist activity. For example, either way, the strange happenings at the farm persisted. Billy's 158 cows now refused to enter their fields, and their milk yield was down somewhere in the region of 15% by October. On October 30th, November 12th, Pauline was driving back from Talbini with her mother, Frances Greyes, and 4 children, Karen, Joanne, and Leanne, and 15-year-old Katrina, when they saw an enormous disc fly over them, headed towards Stack Rocks. Pauline said, quote, "I swear this is true. We all saw it. It vanished into the rock between 2 doors that seemed to slide open." End quote. They parked the car and walked along the coastal path, attempting to get a better view. Quote, "We all saw the door again, and this time 2 silvery figures walking on the edge of the rock. Then after a bit, they retreated inside the rock." End quote. By this point, sick of the media insinuation that the family were liars and fantasists, the Coombs were only talking to Paget about their experiences. At the local garage, Billy had been told to stop making up stories because it was bringing land prices down, but they weren't alone in this sighting. When Pauline got home, she received a phone call from Rosa Glanville, owner of the Haven Fort Hotel and Stack Rocks Island, who had observed the scene through binoculars along with her husband and daughter. In February 1978, Pauline saw another space-suited figure walking past her house and up towards the deserted aerodrome at South Hill. This time she thought the visor of its helmet was down, and she could make out shoulder-length fair hair. When Paget visited her after this sighting, Pauline appeared to be sunburned. Even as the Coombs experience wound down, sightings were still recorded in the surrounding area. In May 1978, for instance, a red ball-like UFO frightened holidaymakers at St. Bride's Haven, about a mile from Ripperston Farm. Flying low along the coast towards Stack Rocks, the sight had put people running from the water and deserting the beach in panic.